Hello, everybody out there in podcast land. Welcome to the Practical Prepper podcast. My name is Nick. I am one of your hosts. You've probably heard from my associate Joe, as well as a few others. It's been a while. We're trying to get back on schedule. There's been the new year, Christmas, 2021 and then 2022. We've got train lootings going on now. Betty White died. She didn't make it to 100. Rest in peace. And of course, our friend Omicron making everything extremely difficult. So needless to say that sitting down and finding time to record a podcast has not been easy. But anyhow, we're back on track and we're very excited to bring you today's topic on EMP. Now, my guest who's joining us today is no stranger to the Practical Prepper podcast. He's joined us before. There's a few episodes over on valleyfoodstorage.com, which is the perfect place to say thank you for them. They are our sponsor. They're providing you with high quality calories and high quality ingredients and 25 years of shelf life on all of their freeze-dried foods. So if you go over there and check them out, it would be greatly appreciated. So again, thank you to Valley Food Storage, and that's where you'll be able to find this podcast as well. Anyhow, our guest today, his name is Andy. He's done a decade in the Marine Corps, and he is a infrastructure and business resilience consultant. So when he's telling you about today's topic on electromagnetic pulse, that way you know he has some credibility. Anyhow, let's get into it. Andy, how are you, my friend?
Oh, great. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. Glad to be here. Thanks for coming, taking time out of your day, doing this for us.
Let's talk about the end of the world, man.
Let's do it. So let's just get started with, let's just pretend that I have no idea what EMP is. And let's be honest, when I first got the memo for this and I read EMP, I figured it had something to do with the environment, protecting the environment, and I was very wrong. But since I've done the research, I now know it's something completely different. So what is EMP?
So a simple breakdown is it is an overcharge of electricity. Something happens, 9 times out of 10, you'll see like the DoD and the military, what they default to is another country launches nuclear weapons. Those nuclear weapons explode high in the air, so people on the ground get less nuclear radiation effects and less, blast damage and stuff like that. But there's an electromagnetic wave that comes through and fries all the circuits and takes out power grid. So that's kind of the way the military looks at it. There are other things that can come out of the EMP or can cause EMPs and things like that. A lot of times, solar flares, geomagnetic storms, solar storms. And in my opinion, it's probably more common to see that. Listen, Russia might, finish the invasion of Ukraine next week, but I don't anticipate right now that Russia's going to launch nukes that are going to airburst over the country and then cause EMPs.
Right.
Yeah. So, but back to, what is it? It's just, think of it like an overcharge of electricity, and it fries all electrical things. One of the other big things is, so this overcharge of electricity, it goes from the air down to the ground, but when it hits the transmission wires that are like around people's neighborhoods and things like that, anything attached to those transmission wires is then how that electrical charge starts going. And if you've got transformers or other things that are attached to it, it'll pop all those and you'll lose power. And if you do it on a large enough scale, you can have whole cities lose power, just kind of because of that diffusion of energy.
Yeah. Something like an electromagnetic pulse attack kind of sounds very sci-fi. It sounds like a pretty wild thing. How destructive is this blast, and how long do these effects really last if this were to happen, or when it has happened in the past?
So, interesting point. Now, using the military's version of this high altitude explosive piece, then you have 3 pieces of the EMP itself. You've got E1, E2, and E3. So the E1 phase is kind of gonna last about a millisecond or a nanosecond, and that is the initial broadband pulse that makes up a lot of different frequencies, and it's going to affect a lot of different things on the ground. This is where you're going to get the most damage electronically. So then you move into E2, which is less powerful, but it still lasts a few nanoseconds to milliseconds, I believe. Maybe 1 or 2 seconds long. So then you're going to see the radiation from the blast interact with different layers of the atmosphere, and this is going to be something similar to a big lightning strike hitting something. And when, lightning strikes, you just see this massive discharge of current. It'll be just like that minus the actual bolt of lightning. So same thing. And, on like a times a million scale, of course. So you'll see electric devices getting damaged, fuses getting popped, transformers blowing up, things like that. So then this is weaker than E1, but then there's E3. So E3 is the last phase of it, and this can kind of last for about several minutes. It's less powerful, but this is where we start getting into the cascading effects. So it's the weakest part of the EMP. This is basically the reaction between Earth's magnetic field and the explosion that caused the EMP in the first place. So this is going to be similar to a really strong solar flare, which also can cause EMPs. Now, this is the part where it hits the power lines and the transmission lines and starts transmitting out and radiating out, everything like that. So it overheats transformers, trips safety relays, things like that. One thing interesting to note, new communication lines are not conductive. And if things aren't conductive, this is not a problem. So when things go down, the power plants or the power system can go down. However, modern telecommunications and maybe like fiber lines and things like that are not conductive won't be affected. So interesting pieces on both fronts. But then, so after E3, we get into the cascading effects. How long can this last? Cascading effects being, if you have an older power grid, if you're in a city in the Midwest, a smaller town or something like that, you might be out of power for a few weeks. You can see things like Texas that happened last year when everything was frozen,
right,
and people were going through a lot of issues because they weren't prepared. The power grid went offline. You'd see a lot more of that going on in the cascading effects of just after the EMP. So you've got to deal with the build back and all the fixing and stuff. Then I want to point out, factor in COVID, which is what we're seeing now, when you can't get enough crews to work because they just have labor shortages or they have rules that they have to follow.
Yeah.
So cut your workforce 50% and then get the power to a city restored as fast as possible. Like, things are going to get a little bit different.
Yeah, then you start pulling people from other states have got to come, and people have got less work there. But let's back up to, and now I wasn't I didn't know this, but so all of the power grids, and this is a little bit off topic, but all the power grids are not the same age. Some of them are newer throughout the country than, because there's other things out there that are like the way on the conspiracy side that the whole country's on one giant power grid and it's all the same age and it's super old, and if one domino falls, they all fall. So there's newer power grids that are not as easy to attack or wouldn't suffer as greatly from something like this.
Yeah, so I think somebody's going to have to fact check me at home, but there is 3 major power grids in the country: the East Coast, the West Coast, and Texas has its own.
Of course.
So yeah, obviously
Right.
Texas has its own, and they don't
Right.
want to tie into the larger grid because they're Texas.
But it didn't prove well for them because they had a storm and it was like the apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly. But but now they're going to put more money into that and they're going to fix it so it doesn't happen
Right.
again. People in Texas are learning and things like that. But you're right. So you have older power grids just out in places where they don't spend the money on these things, and
Fair enough.
they just can't get them up to speed as fast. It's just the nature of doing business, right? I can't make the power grid non-conductive overnight. I can't.
Right.
And then when you start talking about like standards, that construction standards for buildings, like government buildings, that are, you have to meet XYZ standard, and we can probably put it in the show notes. I have the DoD docs, but standards to defeat EMPs for the whole building to be grounded and stuff like that. It's not simple. It's really in depth. Like doorways, the current goes over the doorways and stuff like that. It gets really in depth to how these people have to design and build them. So none of this is a quick process.
And I'm sure an EMP attack itself is also not a quick or cheap attack to orchestrate. I had read somewhere notes that it would be easier and cheaper for you to just simply place explosives onto a large-scale power system and obliterate it than to orchestrate an entire EMP blast and take it all down, and hopefully that it lasts as long as, because if you are, when your power goes out and it's out for the whole day, that was just a natural cause of it going out for the whole day. And this is only lasting seconds, but it's way more destructive than obviously what we're prepared for, which would be a tree going down and taking your whole neighborhood offline because of power lines.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, so you're right. There's a lot cheaper and easier ways to do it. Sometime, maybe like 10 years ago, there was a alleged Chinese agent that went and shot up a power station in California. Literally just took an AK and put like 50 rounds through a transformer box, shut down the grid for a little bit. I mean, it was just that simple, right?
Yeah.
Then we can look at the Colonial, the Colonial pipeline this past summer.
Yeah.
That the Russian hackers shut down, things like that. Yeah. So they took the whole pipeline down. People were filling everything they could with gas.
Madness.
It was out of this world.
Yeah.
Funny story about those hackers. We'll just off topic it for the sake of it. But I was talking to those guys maybe about a month before that attack, just trying to see what they were about. They were advertising stuff on the internet. So as bad guys normally do. But I said, hey, da 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 da, and I threw some financial terms out to them just to see, what they would tell me about what targets that they were going to hit next,
right,
for work. And they literally came back to me. I said, hey, if I explain it to you in market cap and things like that, do you understand what I'm saying? They came back to me, not even in Russian or translated Russian, but in perfect English. And they said, we do this for a living. I can tell you anything you want to know about financials. And it was hilarious. Yeah. It was hilarious. But yeah, so there's cheaper and easier ways to conduct these attacks.
Right.
But more so, the interesting part of this is if there was an EMP attack. Let's say there was this high altitude nuke that goes off and one country attacks another country. That's one thing. However, if there's the solar flare or this giant solar storm or things like that, it's going to affect the entire planet.
Right.
We're not going to get. It's not going to be a neighborhood if the solar flares are big enough, or this coronal mass ejection. If the coronal mass ejections are big enough, then we have a huge problem on our hands, like very, very large.
Yeah. So the natural one that I read about was an unexpected geomagnetic storm. So it triggered an event on the Hydro-Quebec power system. Said that the total collapse happened within 92 seconds. And this was caused by a 1 trillion cubic mile plume of superheated plasma emitted by the sun. Now that definitely sounds like sci-fi nonsense that you would see in a movie, but this happened, and this left 6 million people without power. So it's that kind of thing. Given when this happened, this was years ago, I believe it was 84 or something, in the 80s, something like that. We are now much more equipped to deal with, our grid is much more powerful. Our technology is much, much more capable of, this couldn't happen again. Or could it happen again?
Oh, it could definitely happen again.
Yeah.
It could 100% happen again. And I think we're seeing that the shift to green energy that's going on right now is not exactly going as well as it could be. There's a lot of hiccups. The power grid that is running on green energy cannot provide the power needed to sustain everyone, as we just get more and more electronic stuff to plug in all the time. So they can't handle the load, third order effects down the line. It just makes the grid that much weaker as a whole. This can happen again. If something does happen, it will be drastically different than what happened in the 80s, when there was just a lot less things were powered back then. A lot less things were plugged into the grid. Now we have so much more plugged into the grid.
Yeah.
We have 30 cell phones in a house if you have kids, things like that. Everything's going crazy. There's a lot more demand for the grid, and some places have grids that have a lot less output for whatever reason.
And in turn, it would make more sense then for a country to think, okay, now we're more connected than ever. So obviously there are other countries working on a weapon to take everybody offline. Because then 80s versus now, everybody is on their phone and the internet everywhere they go. So if there was a way to be like, it's off, we can shut it all down, then that leaves you extremely vulnerable. So based off of that, an actual orchestrated attack from a country versus natural, which one is of more concern, would you say?
I'm going to go with the natural on that, solar flare. So if there's anybody listening and they do radio communications, ham radio operators, things like that, which is awesome, and everybody should look it up and get into it. But comm guys will always tell you that it's I can't get communications to work with station whatever because of solar flares or this, that, or the other that's interfering with communications. They see it very often, and they have charts every day that they'll look at and see when a solar flare is coming up, because it might screw with the communications depending on how far the shot is. But when the solar flares get big enough where everybody's affected by it, that would be more likely to me than bad guys popping off EMP weapons. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there are ways to defend against this stuff. There are. It's not difficult. There's ways to secure yourself against it. It's not out of the realm of possibility at all.
Yeah. So in 62, the Starfish Prime, it was a thermonuclear weapon. It was detonated about 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. It was 100 times bigger than Hiroshima. And this caused electrical damage 900 miles away from where it was detonated, which affected a large portion of Hawaii, which brought down the phone lines, anything that was going on over there. So, I mean, obviously I can see how if the sun emits a plume over the planet, it's way, way more effective than that. But people are worried about the attack side, the thermonuclear side, like we were talking about a little bit offline before we started, like somebody doing that over DC and kind of trying to bring down the country's infrastructure by hitting the center of essentially the country.
Yeah, I mean, they've said that if you triangulate some of these high altitude nukes, you can take out a large swath of our infrastructure at once. And then when you do that, I mean, let's use Ukraine as an example, because as we're recording this, Russia's kind of massing their forces, doing whatever they're going to do. Mm-hmm. If they wanted, there's a million other ways that they're going to do this and can do this. However, if they wanted to, they could just pop a few of these in the high altitude level over Ukraine or over Kiev. No, yeah, whatever. Anyway, and then boom, the power's out, the command structure, they have no idea what's going on. The president and the prime minister are sitting there going, I don't know what's going on. What do we do? And by that time, the tanks are already rolling across the border. Right.
So, this is not going to happen in reverse, because I'm assuming based off of the size of your country and the the funds that you have to orchestrate this, obviously easy for Russia to do to Ukraine. Not so easy for Ukraine to attempt to pull this on Russia.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Ukraine, they've got some other issues.
Yeah.
It's the last thing on their mind.
So in what context were you made aware of EMP? Was it just through your work, or obviously maybe you've experienced this in some degree?
So I worked on a project a while back, and the project was, so essentially when you build a data center, right, you need to, where you house all your servers and you do all this thing, there is so much redundancy planning that goes into that, and there's a lot of money to be spent on that. And there's a lot of people that really do want to make sure nothing bad can happen to it. So we would go through all of our plans and we'd say, okay, if we put it here, are we on a shelf for earthquakes? If we put it here, what's our redundancy for backup power? Do we have, how big of a generator can we get to build into the building? So if something goes wrong, we have this, backup generator that's locked into the building, and we can run it for XYZ to keep the data center running. So we can, everybody that's in the data center, whether they be government clients or whatever, they can keep their operations running as well. Amazon, you don't want Amazon to go down.
Right.
Maybe not, Amazon's not the best example, but you don't want a government data center
large
to go
example
down.
of if something massive were to go down.
If something massive were to go down and you couldn't get your Amazon Prime, you might be a little bit concerned.
Right.
That's fair.
Hey, train looters, they did it right there.
Yeah.
Easier than EMP.
So do we need horses for train looting, or can I use a dirt bike now?
I'm not sure what they did, but I like to imagine that it was they did it on horses, kind of like Pirates of the Wild Wild West, and I did hear, again, completely off topic, but it was a derailed train. And then I don't know if it was just like guerrilla warfare. They were hiding in the shadows and they came out of nowhere. But the photos of it they're terrifying. It looks like, given LA always there's just garbage everywhere, but this is extreme. I mean, the track is full of packages. So if anybody out there has been expecting a package from UPS, USPS, FedEx, any of it that could have been on that Union train, you might want to get in contact with with whoever your shipping provider is, because it might not be coming.
I want to go out there and see what these bums took from Amazon or UPS or whatever. They
got it all.
Like random pink Gucci boas and stuff. They're just walking around. Oh, that's great.
They'll be easy to spot, I can tell you that. But anyhow, so back to the EMP. So if we're talking about it on a large scale here of a country detonating a thermonuclear weapon, but what about just for the everyday person? Like, how do you how do you prepare for it? And I know that we had talked about like the Faraday cages and the Faraday products. And I also read about paints that they were using, because it is easier to paint something with a protective like powder coating as opposed to building a giant cage around it. So if you could talk a little bit about that, or like a Faraday cage, what is a Faraday cage?
So a Faraday cage just grounds. The cage will just kind of ground out everything and make it less conductive. Nothing will travel out of it or into it. It's so you line it with things that are conductive, like you'd line it with copper, and then when the electricity hits that copper, it just kind of disperses it around whatever the server, the computer.
But you couldn't operate from inside of it then. So if nothing can get out,
so that's where you go into this DoD construction stuff. If you built these buildings to spec like that, then yeah, it would be like one giant Faraday cage, and if something happened, it would like disperse this energy over the top of it and down into the ground.
Yeah.
So, however, that's not really realistic for the average person.
Right.
There's kits, and they're not expensive, but there's vehicle kits where it's like 3 wires, and you just plug a like positive, negative, and ground it on your car, and it'll essentially just ground out everything. But going into vehicles brings me to the point. So there was a test done at one point, and there was like 40 or so newer vehicles, and they tested each of them against an EMP, and they found out that if they get hit with an EMP, the vehicles will still run. You just turn the keys off, you just roll the key back and roll it back on. The car will start. You can drive the car. You can, get to wherever you need to go. What would happen a lot of times is they would have like nuisance issues, and it would like your headlights would blow out, or your blinkers would not work, your windshield wipers wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Those fuses would pop, and it would just blow right through those fuses because it was so much power. However, they found out that the cars are actually really redundant. Now, I would have to look back at this study and see that we have, 2022 cars are essentially all computers anyway. I don't know. I would love to see this test done against the Tesla.
Yeah, like electric cars.
Yeah, just to see how that works. But the cars that they used for this test, let's say they're like 2010 models or whatever, but combustion engines, it would still work. You could still drive that car and get to wherever you needed to be.
That is interesting.
So yeah, and goes along same thing with your house. So the big thinking is you need 3 things. You need conductive metal shielding, you need filtering, and you need surge protection. If you get those 3 things, you can, in various degrees, you'll be just fine from an EMP. You'll be good. What would happen a lot of times would be, and we can think surge protection kind of like surge protectors in our house. However, it needs to be bigger than that, obviously. But when we think about different surge protection, think about things that'll happen, things that'll pop in your house. Like if an EMP hits, the transmission lines running in your house will just overcharge everything with electricity. Breakers in your house will pop, and it'll pop all the breakers, maybe it'll go through some of the breakers or overload some of the breakers, but not everything will get destroyed. Some stuff will get destroyed, some stuff won't.
So how likely is it that this does happen? It pops all your breakers. You're like, what the hell's going on? You go downstairs. How likely are you to be able to just go click and put all your breakers back on and just go about your day? Or
Unlikely.
So that is going to get, you're in for a hefty bill if this occurs at your home.
Yeah, it's going to fry some things because it's also going to fry the things that got there. If it gets to you, it's going to fry everything in the power grid that is on that line is going to get to you too. So it's not going to be it's not going to be an easy day or a quick turnover. Again, think of it like about 1 million lightning strikes in the same place, and then with no bolts of lightning, but the same amount of electricity.
Yeah. So if we back up to the chart that we were talking about, so you got E1, E2, E3. Now any time an EMP is measured, it's not always going to go, or it's not going to go through all 3 phases. Or is an EMP does it go through all 3 phases every time?
It will go through all 3 phases every time, because the phases are essentially just the spike in frequency and current and things like that, and then the dissipation of it.
Okay.
So it'll go through those 3 phases. And to be specific, that is how the DoD measures the high altitude nuclear explosion EMPs.
Yeah.
That will go through all those 3 phases. Yes, all the time.
Okay.
Solar flares would be different, and I'm not sure off the top of my head what those phases kind of look like.
Yeah. So back to the list of saying if you have these 3 things, let's kind of go through that. And for the people listening at home, say that if they wanted to leave right now and go, okay, I want to get this stuff. Now, the surge protection is pretty straightforward. The one that, like the conductive metal shielding, obviously you don't drive down the road and see anybody with a shield, like a barrier over their home. Now, could this be to the point where, and I'm assuming this would be very expensive, but say you had your roof, constructed of this conductive. Now, would that qualify as protection? Like, say if your roof was built out of this conductive metal shielding, Faraday style, would you, if this occurs, are you good or not so much?
I'm gonna say no.
Okay.
And then again, in the show notes, we'll have to put these documents in here because
I'll put the graph in there and everything so you can check it out.
Yeah, the way these construction documents are made in order to dissipate all the energy from EMP and things like that, it is in depth. I don't know if you can do less than that and still have the same results. It's the government, so I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can do a third of this and you'd be okay.
Right.
However, they really go into some science and some in-depth building construction stuff, which blows my mind. And they putting something on your roof to help dissipate it probably not going to help.
Yeah.
I mean, it might help, but it probably isn't going to save the day. But I mean, there's different things you can buy online, like Google EMP Shield or something like that.
Yeah.
There's EMPshield.com. They sell kits. They're not expensive. If that's up your alley, if you want to build your own, you can probably build your own, or you could buy one of theirs for your home or your vehicle, RV, things like that.
What about the special filtering? What exactly is that?
So the special filtering is a little bit out of my realm as I'm not an electrical engineer. However, it's going to protect you from the E1 phase. So when E1 hits and you have that giant initial explosion and all the frequency stuff, you're filtering for the frequency. So when this EMP pops, there's all this electromagnetic frequency and it goes over such a large frequency scale, you get this special filtering that filters out certain frequencies and it just blocks them in different ways.
And this is the most devastating part of the EMP. That initial burst is like, if you have any sort of protection, you want to be protected in the E1 phase versus 2, 3, because it's getting less powerful, obviously, like anything. When it starts, it's its most powerful. Hurricane, it starts out in the ocean, most powerful. When it hits the land, it dies off.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So if you can get this filtering, you're just filtering out things that'll like conductive to this frequency on the electromagnetic spectrum, blah, blah, blah. And again, this is well outside my wheelhouse, is like electrical engineer stuff.
Right.
But you're trying to slow it down or impede that as much as you can to get from getting, to your devices and popping your stuff.
Yeah. And we talked about this probably weeks before the EMP when we were first talking about doing the podcast, and I didn't know this either. So this EMPs is where the tinfoil hat came from.
Yes.
So, and I didn't want to leave that out because that's very important.
Yeah. So the EMP tinfoil hat thing really did come from there. So all these people are like, oh, tinfoil hats, I'm prepared for the EMPs.
So they were under the impression that the EMP at this point was going to be used for some sort of mind control. Like an EMP is going to go off, or I mean, it doesn't. If you've done any of this research or read what it does to an infrastructure, it has literally nothing to do with your mind. So wearing the tinfoil hat on your head at this point, like it has become, is just a joke.
I mean, is it? Is it?
I mean,
listen.
I guess.
Nobody can see me at home, but I have a tinfoil hat on right now because I'm prepared for the EMP.
We both have tinfoil hats on currently, so maybe it's not that big of a joke. Cue the X-Files music. Anyway, back to what we were talking about. So, just to be, if I leave here right now, what can I do to be prepared? Is it more of just the newer age, like the Faraday computer case and phone case? So if it does happen, I still have those two things. But if I have them and the power grid's down, they're useless to me. So if I individually protect all of my stuff, but my overarching network is now compromised, was it all for nothing? It'll save me money in the long run because they'll get that back up, right? Probably.
They will get it back up,
Yeah.
and then the newer communication lines, again, they're not conductive, and I forget what they specifically make them out of, but it avoids all of that stuff because the electricity can't travel down them and pop anything on either end.
Oh, okay.
So that is good as far as the new telecommunication lines, and at least in some places. I don't know if it's global or whatnot, but if you shield your stuff, you use Faraday bags, make Faraday cages if you want. Get these different EMP EMP devices that'll save you. EMPshield.com. But if you do that stuff, you're better off.
Yeah.
You're more likely to be better off in the event of catastrophe because the grid's going to be down. Look at Texas. If the grid's down for a week, people are going crazy. You're still going to be able to maybe have a backup generator that's up and running. Then you can power your house. You can power radio electronics if you need to use, your ham radio license operators out there, folks that are coordinating via that. I mean, if you shield and save your electronics the right way, then you just have an easier life when things go bad.
Right.
It's that simple. Like the person who's in the Stone Age for a week is going to have a much more difficult life than the person who's got their generator running and they got their lights on and things like that because everything was grounded properly and protected. Yeah.
Well, that's what we always say is that you can't prevent a disaster, but you certainly can be prepared for it.
100%.
So, I guess, well, it's a good synopsis for the topic. We'll wrap it up with, so just in general for everybody out there who's wondering after we've run the gamut of being attacked by Russia and thermonuclear weapons detonating over the Capitol, how concerned should the everyday citizen be with this happening?
On a scale, I don't know. See, I don't know where to put it on a scale. I think you should be prepared for this. I do not think you need to. I think there are much bigger things to be prepared for. I think don't waste too much brain power on this. I mean, there's other things that you need to be worried about well before this.
Yeah.
And if this does happen, it happens. So
much like everything else, if it happens, it happens.
I mean, if you prepare for a power outage, then you're well on your way to preparing for this as well.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think it's likely. I know there's a lot of fear mongering out there that people are like, oh, we'll go back to the Stone Age and we'll do this, and if this happens, and this coronal mass ejection. I don't think anybody really needs to lose sleep over this, to be honest.
Right.
Just be prepared, understand what you need to do, or these little tweaks here and there, a couple $100 here and there to tweak and get what you need, get some food, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing as being prepared for a power outage.
Absolutely.
You don't need to start like sharpening spears and things like that. And like,
change your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No need.
Well, thanks so much, man. I appreciate your time and your effort and your research, and it's been eye-opening. This has been a good one. I like this one a lot, so I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's been a blast.
Thank you, and thank you guys for listening. We'll catch you on the next one. Wow, what an episode that was. Thanks so much to Andy and for offering his knowledge on EMP and spending a little bit of time with us today. That was very insightful. I learned a lot. I don't know about you. If you didn't, or if you did, please let us know. Either reply to the email that you received this podcast in, or just contact our customer service and let us know what you thought about the guest, the host, the topic, anything. What you'd like to hear about in the future. We take all of that very seriously, and we will definitely, it'll be put to good use. Also like to say thank you to our sponsor, Valley Food Storage, who are the leader in freeze-dried and long-term food. They have clean ingredients, high-quality calories, and a 25-year shelf life. It's perfect for any seasoned prepper or a suburban family just looking to stay safe. Now, they've been gracious enough to give us an exclusive code for all of our podcast listeners. So that's all of you who have made it this far in the podcast. You get to reap the reward. So at checkout, if you enter Practical15, that's PRACTICAL15, you can take 15% off your entire order. Now, they don't usually do this. They usually reserve discounts and codes for Black Friday or giant sales that they run. So having an inclusive code from Valley Food Storage is a huge deal, and thank you so much to them. Now, that about wraps it up. We covered a lot today, and I really appreciate you listening. So you're better than you were 30 minutes ago, and never forget that knowledge is our greatest weapon. This is Nick from the Practical Prepper Podcast, signing off. Thank you so much.